subject now. I want to take you to what the potential Treasurer said about first home buyers, and in particular about what happens if your house falls in price. Now, to me, I don't know about you, but to me, thinking that my house that I had bought for, I don't know, let's say the average price in Sydney, 700 grand, I had a 10% deposit, and then the price fell by 15%, so I was underwater. The pressures that would cause on, A, my household budget and spending, and me personally trying to keep my job, that'd be a pretty big responsibility. Well, according to Chris Bowen, talking to Triple J, you don't have to worry about this. Just go and take advantage of the first-time buyer scheme and buy.
Well, you only lose money if you sell the house when you're in negative equity. I mean, sometimes lots of people go into negative equity when the housing market does fall. I remember when I first was in the housing market, I went into negative equity for a while. You sort of look at it carefully, but unless you actually sell, then you haven't actually lost any money. The market does come back.
Problem is, if you lose your job, you have to sell. If you get divorced, you have to sell. Your business goes bust, you have to sell. And then guess what? It is very much a one-way street to bankruptcy. Somebody who knows more about negative equity than most in Australia is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, who patterns or who sort of measures the patterns of this trend. He's on the line right now. Martin, many thanks for your time.
Hello.
So in your view right now, how many people in Australia are in negative equity?
Around 400,000 and just growing a little bit now, and that includes both property investors and owner-occupied borrowers across the country, and that's about 10% of borrowers.
So just explain, when a person is in negative equity, what sort of emotions would be going through their head, what sort of stresses would be coming on that household?
Yeah, so the point about negative equity is the mortgage is actually bigger than the value of the property. Now, of course, there are two things. One is, if you have to sell, if you're forced to sell, then you probably won't get top dollar for the property in any case. So even if you see, publicly available data about what properties are really worth, if you were forced to sell, you'd probably get less. And of course, there are transaction fees. So that's one question. How much am I really in deep water? The second is, though, that all my surveys say that once people get into negative equity, then they change their behaviour. They do two things differently. Firstly, they spend less because they are actually just feeling less wealthy, which means, of course, they don't spend so much at the shops and those sorts of things. They may even try and pay down the mortgage faster. So it's those sorts of sort of factors in play. Plus, of course, it's quite often that negative equity leads to broader issues in terms of finances and even relationship breakups and those sorts of things. So there is a social cost to negative equity. It isn't just a financial score.
And do you think it is responsible for a prospective treasurer to be saying, look, go out and buy a home even if you end up in negative equity? It doesn't matter. You'll sort it out later on. That's not the way I would like to think that people would be buying property. Surely you'd be trying to work out when you imagine you can buy that property and afford that property and continue to repay off any mortgage you might take on. But hopefully you wouldn't be dipping down into any form of negative equity because you'd have a big enough deposit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really a bit worrisome that is the sort of the attitude. It'll be okay, it'll work itself out. Remember that in Ireland and the UK, a decade after the global financial crisis, when property prices dropped 30 to 40%, there are still households today in negative equity, and that meant they were locked into the property that they had. They could not move. They could not refinance, so they actually have higher mortgage rates than other people. There are a whole bunch of consequences for going into negative equity, and I actually think that just saying it'll bounce back really is not giving full weight to the significance of this factor. We haven't had this scenario in Australia for a generation, and I can tell you, as somebody who's worked in the industry for many, many years here and overseas, negative equity is a real killer, and it's a killer from all sorts of dimensions, and it doesn't tend to work itself out quickly and easily, particularly as we're suggesting that home prices will continue to slide and go sideways for quite some time.
And the other thing that's also important to note to people is that it's not just the individuals that have the stress, but then increasingly it can be the banks themselves and their own mortgage books.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point to us, because at some point the banks are going to have to, take account of these falling values. Now, in the last reporting round, ANZ said 5% of their book was in negative equity. I think NAB said about 1%, and CBA said 3% of their books were in negative equity. But if you look carefully, it's not clear when they last benchmarked the value of those properties. And they're looking at one individual loan, not the total loan spread and portfolio of that particular household. When you actually take that into account, the total weight is much bigger. If there are those sorts of risks in the system, banks have to hold more capital. That means that essentially the costs of those mortgages go up, so you'd expect the rates to be charged on those mortgages to consumers will also go up, and there are higher risks in the system as well. This can become a significant contagion that can impact the banking system, the property sector, as well as individuals.
And indeed, then the overall economy, there's no doubt. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, always great with his time, but you can see that is a real problem. It is no joking matter. It is not something where you should be given what I'd call spurious advice by a would-be treasurer who says, don't worry, you'll be right, she'll be right. That attitude of she'll be right with property, it's not always the case, because it is sometimes a long time between booms. And remember that it's really not that long that these prices have been falling. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, as always, we appreciate your time.
Good to talk to you.